Hey, good evening, everybody. My name is Melissa, and I'm your streamer for tonight. If you can hear me, I want to make sure everything's working. Could you just drop an emoji in the chat and let me know how you're feeling about school these days? At my school, we actually are having finals this week, which is really weird. I know for a lot of you who did finals in December. So I'm a little, even as a teacher, because finals is a lot of pressure for students and for teachers. I'm seeing people can hear me, which is great. I'm seeing a few different emojis. Daisy, I'm sorry that you've got more of a downer emoji. I'm hoping that tonight's stream can help everybody feel a little bit more positive, at least about AP World History. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly so you can see some things. And then I'll talk a little bit about who I am and what we're doing tonight. Okay, so my name's Melissa, and I've been a streamer with Fiveable for almost a year. I stream for AP World History Modern, and I teach AP World History in Washington State, so not DC. I'm one of those crazy people who always thinks of Washington State whenever I hear Washington. So that's where I am at. Been teaching AP World for 10 or 11 years now, and so been through a lot of different changes with the curriculum, but this is a unit that I always find really interesting to teach. I think it's hard to say I enjoy teaching it in some ways because there are some real hard things that we have to teach about, but also this is one that I think students get a lot out of and learn a lot from. And so I enjoyed that part of teaching modern imperialism. A little bit of logistics before we get going into some things. If this is your first time ever streaming with us at Fiveable, welcome. We are so thrilled to have you. You probably noticed the chat going on, and I would love to have your participation in the chat. So if you have questions or comments or feedback as we go along, we love to hear that. We've got teachers in the chat, as well as I can see the chat and respond back to you that way. Students in the chat also help each other out. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to drop them there. When you're typing into the chat, sometimes Crowdcast will ask you if you want to make it a formal question. And if you choose to do that, that's great, because then I can see the question even if I miss it in the chat. And so go ahead and use that ask a question function if there's something you definitely want me to answer at any point. And that's about it. I think we should get going tonight. So just a quick plug for Fiveable, right? That's the organization that is hosting this live stream that you're watching tonight. Our goal is to make AP classes as accessible as possible and to help students feel confident that they are able to earn that 5. And we are out there on the internet, social media as well. So look out for us. Be on the lookout for what we're doing. Cool things are happening all the time with Fiveable. How many of you came in from our trivia that we just had? We just wrapped up a trivia round of questions about imperialism about a half an hour ago. I see a couple of you came over from trivia. Welcome. I'm glad that you came from doing that. If you don't know about our trivia nights, Fiveable is now hosting live trivia sessions. No matter how well or badly you do, getting that practice with multiple choice questions is a great opportunity. So I would encourage you to check out upcoming trivia options. Some upcoming streams, since you already know how to get to a live stream. That's another big thing for what we do. Monday nights at 8:30 Eastern, every Monday we are having a current events and election update stream. So you can kind of get a handle on what's going on in the world if that's something that you're interested in. For our world history streams, we are on Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern. And we've got some really great streams coming up. We'll have some practice multiple choice questions for units 5 and 6. So if you are one of those folks who think you didn't do so great at trivia night tonight, come back next Thursday for the practice multiple choice. Eric and Jed are going to be leading that. They are both a great team, a teacher and a former student in AP World History. So come back for their stream. In a couple of weeks, we're going to have a stream on causation in the age of imperialism. Evan's going to be teaching that. He's awesome. And then later in February, Eric will be back with some practice short answer questions, all in this kind of units 5 and 6, 1750 to 1900 time window that we are in. So there's a lot of good content coming for you. So just keep coming back. Keep coming back for more. For tonight, though, we've got a packed agenda. They gave me one of the big ones, probably because I talk really fast. So I'm going to do my best to talk at a reasonable speed, maybe not as fast as Crash Course, I hope, but still get through a lot of content. So we're talking about imperialism in the modern world. So we're going to give some definitions. We'll talk about rationales for imperialism. We'll talk about state expansion, the actual practice of imperialism. We'll talk about economic imperialism. And if you've never heard of what that is, you'll know by the end of tonight. I'm going to talk about response. I'm probably going to spend a lot of my time talking about responses to imperialism, because I think it's one of the places where a lot of textbooks are weak. And I want to supplement what I think you are learning. And then at the end, I've got a couple of practice questions just so you can see how some of this content might show up on the AP exam. But more than anything, I want to answer as many of your questions as I can tonight. So ask them throughout, but there will be some time dedicated to questions at the end. Before I jump in, I want to say this. This is a huge agenda. This content right here takes me about 3 weeks to teach in my classroom, and I'm doing it in an hour tonight. So this is not going to replace you studying or give you everything you might need to know for the AP exam. My goal in about an hour, to answer the question I see in the chat, it's about an hour tonight. My goal in about an hour is to briefly introduce you to this content and give you an example or two to highlight. There are lots of possible examples. I might choose the same examples that your teacher or your textbook uses. I might choose really different examples. I'm choosing out of my kind of comfort zone because I'm going fast tonight, and trying to make sure that that you get an example that I can explain well. There are multiple examples, and it is likely on the AP exam you will see different examples than the specific ones that I cover. But my hope is that by giving you the concepts along with the examples, you can apply those concepts to different examples when you see them in different kinds of questions. All right, so some deep breaths, and we're gonna dive right in. Let me pop over to my question box and make sure I'm not missing any questions before we get started. Mostly it looks like they've been logistical questions, and people are already answering them in the chat. Thanks, chat. You guys are awesome. All right, so let's start with definitions. What is imperialism? In the chat, what do you think? What is imperialism? You might have seen that word before, either in your textbook or heard it used in class. So I want to see, what do you think that word means? Ooh, I'm seeing some great answers jumping out. I'm seeing nation building, taking over places, governments taking over with military power. There's definitely a lot of good knowledge sitting here in the chat already tonight. You guys definitely have some of the ideas of imperialism. So a good working definition for imperialism is imperialism is kind of two things at once. It's both a policy and an action, but imperialism is also an ideology or a belief that this is the right way of doing things. So imperialism is about extending or expanding a country's rule over foreign nations. And what I mean by foreign nations is that it's about one group of people conquering lands or taking control of lands, because it's not always by conquest, but taking control of lands that were previously under the control of another group of people. So we're thinking of a country extending its borders into another nation or another country's borders. Often this is through military force, but sometimes imperialism also takes place through peaceful political change or even economic ways. So as we're thinking about imperialism, there's one thing I want to kind of put in your minds as we go forward, that this imperialism we're talking about tonight in the 19th century, all my examples will pretty much be from the 19th or early 20th centuries. It's not new. So when you're thinking about that AP skill of contextualization, right, we can contextualize imperialism by thinking about the fact that it's been going on for millennia. In fact, empires probably represent one of the most common forms of human government in world history. So if we think about the world history you've learned prior to 750, can you name some examples of empires? The Roman Empire, great job. Yes, the Romans were an empire. The Persian Empire, excellent. So Great Britain's empire begins before 1750, but continues into this time period we'll talk about today. The Ottoman Empire, which again begins earlier. The Greeks, a little bit less so. The idea of a Greek empire is a little bit more complicated, but we see empire building and conquest of other territories by the Greeks. I see the Ottomans again. Good job if you're thinking about the Ottomans. France does create an empire. The Mongol Empire is a great one to think about from previous eras. And the Mongols definitely conquered foreign nations, right? The Russian Empire, absolutely. China, it's good for us to remember that China was an empire, that China spread its territory and conquered foreign nations. The Japanese, most of the Japanese empire building is going to happen during this time period. So they're maybe not a context empire, but the Spanish Empire from 1450 to 1750, absolutely. The Mongols, yes, Daisy, the Mongols were absolutely using imperialism. They were expanding their rule over foreign nations. When the Mongols conquered China, right, they were taking over another group of people and imposing their own system in that place. The Aztecs expanded their empire by conquering foreign nations in Mesoamerica. Egypt in very ancient times had an empire that expanded into foreign nations. We want to be a little careful, George, about the idea of Islamic empire, because that's not the name of any political unit. But if we think about the caliphates, we think about the Abbasid Caliphate, for example, that was empire building. And so that was an empire that was created by a group of people who identified with Islam. So yeah, you guys know about empires already. And a lot of what we talk about is going to fit into that context of empire. Tonight, though, we're going to focus on something that some textbooks call new imperialism. And what they mean by that is 19th century imperialism. And this is particularly the expansion of industrialized empires. The industrialized empires are primarily going to be European empires, the United States, and Japan. And I'm going to try and stay away from saying Europeans all the time. You may catch me doing it, but I want to acknowledge that this imperialism was occurring on a wider scale than just Europe, although the Europeans are certainly a big part of it. And this general definition sticks with us, right? One country extending its rule over a foreign nation by military force or by gaining political and economic control of that area. It's the same process, but there's some new wrinkles that we're going forward with tonight. So one of the things the College Board pays a lot of attention to in its course description for teachers is this idea of rationales for imperialism. And a rationale is like a motivation or a justification, right? So why is imperialism happening in the 19th century? Why are these industrialized nations setting out to conquer other territories? And why are they setting out to conquer the particular territories that they set out to conquer? And a lot of the motives from earlier empire building still exist, but there are some motives that are particular to the 19th century that I want us to notice. You're going to notice tonight there's not a lot of text on my slides, but I'm going to talk you through what the text means. My goal is to give you some key vocabulary. If you're taking notes along with me, write down the vocabulary, and you can always go back and either rewatching this video or in your textbook or your AP study book, or asking your teacher to get more detail about any of these vocab terms. So some of the rationales that are significant in the 19th century include something called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism isn't the same as natural selection, as you might have learned about in your biology class, but it does have similar roots. That's why we see the word Darwinism in there. One of the biology teachers at my school gets super upset when I teach this because he doesn't like anybody using the word Darwinism. So let me talk about social Darwinism. What happened was social scientists, so sociologists and anthropologists and other folks who study people and communities, took the ideas of natural selection and evolution and tried to apply it to their observations of human societies. That's why it's called social Darwinism. And these social Darwinists held the belief that survival of the fittest, right, which is that key phrase about natural selection that you might have learned in biology, that idea, survival of the fittest, could be applied to human communities and could be seen through industrial or technological progress, right? That the fittest societies were the ones that were the most technologically and industrially advanced. It's probably no surprise to you that the leading proclaimers of social Darwinism were from Western industrialized nations. Ooh, shock there. But what they did was that they created rankings of races and societies, and they used what they considered to be scientific methods to quantify how evolved different groups were. And so this winds up meaning that poverty or lack of development was credited to a less evolved state of being, rather than to what we in the 21st century understand as many more complex factors involving political instability, a history of oppression, or geographic challenges, right? None of these things were taken into account. What happened is people observed, oh, these countries are wealthy and technologically advanced, and these countries are poor with less advanced technology. It must be a matter of like evolutionary progress. This is scientific racism. Your textbook might include an image of like evolutionary rankings of different races. A previous AP exam included an image where a man's skin color was being literally rated on an evolutionary scale to see how advanced he was. So like let's not even pretend. We're not going to sugarcoat. This is straight up scientifically justified racism. But this belief was very common among industrialized states in the 19th century. And because this belief was so common and the belief in their own superiority was so widespread, it allowed people to justify taking over what they saw as less evolved areas. So, right, social Darwinism can make us a little bit uncomfortable in our 2020 view of the world. So we have to just remember that this was a commonly accepted view, even though we don't agree with it now. A second factor that plays a role as a rationale for imperialism is nationalism. Those of you who are studying or who have studied the age of revolutions hopefully have talked about this idea of nationalism, this pride in one's country and the belief in one's own nation as being superior to all others. Nationalism results in a lot of different things. It results in revolutions throughout the Atlantic world, results in nation building and the creation of actually whole new countries in the 19th century. Nationalism has some extreme versions that we'll especially see when we study the 20th century that can be really damaging. In the case of imperialism, nationalism and national rivalries are the key here. Western industrialized states competed against one another for colonies and territory, partly because it gave them the resources that they needed, but also partly because having a big empire brought glory to the empire. And so there's this sense of competing to have the most land in addition to competing to have the best land. And so that's a strong motivation for imperialism. So social Darwinism, nationalism, something that your textbook may or may not use this phrase. My textbook doesn't use this phrase, although it conveys this idea in other words. But the College Board uses this phrase, the civilizing mission. The idea for the civilizing mission is both a rationale, a motive for imperialism, and it's also a guiding force behind certain imperial policies. Western imperialists especially see their responsibility to bring what they consider the benefits of civilization to the far corners of the globe. And so conquering and controlling territories in all the parts of the globe is a way to bring them under quote unquote civilized governance. And so imperial conquest then is often followed by civilizing efforts, including religious schools, missions, hospitals, as well as general laws and regulations that attempts to recreate indigenous societies in the model of the conquering country. An easy example of this civilizing mission that sticks in my brain are laws in Hawaii, for example, that required indigenous peoples to wear, or indigenous children to wear Western style clothing when they went to school. Because the traditional clothing of indigenous Hawaiians was seen as uncivilized or barbaric. And so we see, right, this idea of bringing civilization along with these imperial governments. And one of the effects of this civilizing mission is that it means that elites from indigenous populations sometimes benefited from imperialism because the civilizing mission granted access to at least the elites in indigenous populations to Western education. It granted them opportunities for advancement within the colonial system, or sometimes just generally, if they were willing to assimilate into colonial culture. So the civilizing mission is a rationale. It's a part of imperial policies. And one of the effects that it has is reshaping indigenous society to the benefit of elites in indigenous society and often to the harm of non-elites because they don't necessarily have access to the same opportunities. They're not granted the same profits or benefits as elites within their society. I'm seeing some really good mentions in the chat about a famous poem called The White Man's Burden, which is very much kind of along with this idea of a civilizing mission, a response poem, The Black Man's Burden, and what that looks like from a indigenous person's perspective. I would strongly encourage you, as you're thinking about practicing with primary sources, those would be two great sources to practice with and to think about their connections to these ideas in world history. I've got a couple more on this slide, so I'm going to keep talking fast. Sorry. Religious conversion. This one's a little bit tricky to describe, but religious conversion continues to have an important link with imperialism. It's not necessarily like the governing imperialists and the religious folks are the same group, but they're often working hand in hand. And one of the big changes in the 19th century is that the Protestants start to get involved. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Protestants who settled in North America were trying to build their own societies apart from religious oppression in Europe. But in the 19th century, we start to see Protestant mission groups taking a book out of the Catholic page and sending missions to convert people to Christianity in Africa, in India, in Southeast Asia, and in Australia. These missions have an evangelical side, meaning that they have a clear effort to convert people to Christianity. But they often kind of work hand in hand with the Civilizing Mission, because a lot of the schools, hospitals, or other services weren't actually provided by imperial governments. They were allowed by the imperial governments, but they were paid for by religious groups. This group, kind of the different beliefs and rationales, those who are committed to religious conversion are probably the most sincere in their motivations for participating in the expansion of Western dominance, because Christians believe that people's eternal souls are literally in danger unless they are saved. And so sometimes these other motivations kind of overlap, and it's hard to know which one is really most important in people's minds. But for our missionaries, that religious motivation is generally very sincere, very genuine, and very, very important to that group in particular. There is one additional rationale for imperialism that the College Board doesn't specifically mention in their description, which I find hilarious because, right, let's be honest, money is also a huge factor in driving imperialism. And the Industrial Revolution is really connected to this, right? The industrializing nations need raw materials to supply their factories, and they need markets to sell their manufactured goods. And the colonies provided both of these things at a huge profit to the colonizers. Right, so the need for raw materials for factories and increased food supplies for the growing population leads not only to the expansion of empires, but to the development of something called an export economy, which hopefully you'll get a chance to talk about in some other lessons, either here on Fiveable or in your classroom, right? Export economy, write it down and ask your teacher about it. But it's creating an economy that's based on the commercial extraction of natural resources, or the production of either food or industrial crops like cotton or rubber, for the benefit of the colonial motherland or homeland. The profits from the raw materials are used to purchase finished goods, and so these export economies become increasingly dependent on the industrialized countries who are supplying their finished goods. One of the classic mnemonics that I was taught in school about imperialism are the three G's: God, glory, and gold. And what we can see is in 19th century imperialism, all of those G's are still in place. Religious conversion is still important. Nationalism and the glory of the homeland is still really important. Money is a huge motivator for imperialism. And then we have these additions of this kind of more secular civilizing mission and the scientific racism that justified or made imperialism seem okay, even in the face of growing knowledge and understanding of the world's different cultures. So that's rationale. That was a lot, and I'm like almost halfway through my time. So I'm going to peek at the questions in the question box, see if there's anything we need to answer right now. So the question was, is religion also used as a rationale for imperialism? And I would say yes and no. For, I think some groups would see that like imperial conquest can lead to their religious mission, and so they are pro-imperialism. Governments weren't necessarily driven by a desire to spread religion. That was more private religious groups, but they go hand in hand with the imperialists, so it's easiest to talk about them here, if that makes sense. Okay, cool. We'll move on. So let's talk about like the actual state expansion. And again, I want to provide a little bit of contextualization, right? We talked about the idea of context with empires, that empires have been around for thousands of years. This map is what the world looked like at the end of, if you're doing it by units, that was the end of the units 3 and 4, but 1754, right? That 1450 to 1750 period. This is what the world looks like in terms of major empires, with the odd exclusion of China as a major empire. I didn't create this map. This was just the easiest to see one that I could find. So just acknowledge to yourselves that China is also an empire in 1754. But right, notice some familiar players. Right, it's 1754, so we don't have the United States yet because there was no United States in 1754. We have the United Kingdom or Great Britain. We've got France with a little bit of territory, Portugal and Spain with significant territories in the Americas, Russia with some expansion. So this is a snapshot of 1754. Picture this snapshot in your mind. And now take a look at the map of the world in 1898. I couldn't get an animated map that showed this very well, or I would have it go back and forth for you. So 1754 to 1898. So we're at 150 years. By the end of this 1750 to 1900 time period that we're looking at, right, the world looks very different. What do you notice is different from the first map to the second map? The United States exists as a country. Sure. South America is no longer a formal part of these European empires for the most part. Many of the empires are a lot bigger, though, than they were. The Spanish and the Portuguese have less territory, but a lot of countries have more territory. What else are you noticing? India is now under foreign rule, under Britain's rule specifically. Much of South America is independent. Yep. Absolutely. Africa, the story of Africa is huge. The difference from 1754 to 1898 in Africa is, for me, the first place that my eye goes, where I notice that change, right? The colonies are expanded. And seeing the scramble for Africa. Some of you have been studying this unit. So one of the things that the College Board wants you to know is that, right, that empires got bigger in Asia, in the Pacific, in Africa. However, Spanish and Portuguese influence in particular declines after 1750. That age of revolutions and the independence movements, the nationalism of Latin Americans, independent from Spanish or Portuguese control, means that we see a shift and a decline in power for Spain and for Portugal. But the United States, Russia, Japan, France, Britain, Germany, the Netherlands expand their colonial holdings, and in between these two snapshots. It is maybe a little bit subtle and hard to see, but it's worth noting, especially in the case of Russia and the United States that you can see on this map, that we have not only the growth of overseas empires, like we had with the Europeans in the previous era, but we also have a continued expansion of land empires. That we can see the process of expansion in the United States. If you have taken U.S. history, or if you will take U.S. history, you'll talk about manifest destiny and westward expansion. This can be seen as a process of imperialism, taking over territories of indigenous peoples as the United States expands its control and influence westward. For Russia, they're expanding eastward and consolidating control of territories across northern Asia. But what we see here is, right, is a growth in the size of these empires' territories, either overseas claims or contiguous land-based claims. In both cases, empires are growing. Not every empire is growing, but in general, the empires have grown larger over time. So one question that students sometimes ask me is, why didn't the Europeans conquer Africa in the 1500s, right? When we learn about the relationship between Europeans and Africans, it's certainly not because the Europeans respected indigenous African peoples in the 1500s more than they did in the 1800s. And so I want to think about Africa, not just Africa, but Africa will be my primary example. And as we think about new imperialism and why this 19th century imperialism is different, thinking about Africa is a kind of a good place for us to start. And there's two key changes in the 19th century that allows for the expansion of European empires into Asia, generally speaking, and to Africa in particular. So one of the changes is a weakening of previous empires. That empires that had existed in previous eras were increasingly weakened as we get closer to 1750, and as we move in from 1750 into the 19th century, we see just this increasing weakness. for empires. The Mughals in India are increasingly weak. China's Qing dynasty is increasingly weak. The Ottomans are increasingly weak relative to the states around them. African empires have really been devastated by the Atlantic slave trade and other interactions with Europeans that has created some political instability within the region that makes it politically, right? Weakening empires makes it politically easier for an outside power to consolidate control of that territory. Weakening empires are a story of empire building throughout history, right? We see the Mongols taking control when the Song dynasty is weak in China. We see the Ottomans taking control in the Middle East and the Mediterranean when the Byzantine Empire grows weak. So weakening empires are not a new factor. A huge, my webcam says it's still solid. So I don't know, Larry. Hopefully everybody can still see and hear me. One of the huge changes in the 19th century is the increase of industrial technology. Industrial technology is kind of one of the make or break differences for industrial, or for this like 19th century imperialism. Industrial technology includes things like medicine, right? The being able to use quinine to create or to allow Europeans to have a resistance to malaria allows them to conquer tropical territories without just dying from tropical disease. I read once somewhere that the British taste for gin and tonics probably comes from the fact that tonic water has quinine in it, and it was a way to take your medicine without it tasting so bad. So they invented a cocktail that was very popular in tropical colonies throughout the British Empire in order to basically like take medicine that would allow them to survive in that region. Steamships are a huge piece of technology that's relevant to imperialism. They make transportation and communication faster between parts of the empire, and it's easier to control a big empire if you can communicate and move throughout that empire. Railroads create the transportation, communication, and economic infrastructure that supports the industrial powers. You can move people and goods throughout your empire on these railroads. In terms of industrial infrastructure, railroads are one of the few pieces that industrialized nations brought into their colonies. In general, we don't see a lot of factories or other industrial manufacturing moving to the colonies, but we do see railroads because we need to get those raw materials out and we need to get those nice and expensive finished goods back in to the colonies so we can sell them and make money. And then industrial technology also includes industrial weaponry and the development of machine guns and other mechanized weapons. And by mechanized weapons, we're not just talking about machine guns. We're talking about even like bolt action rifles that could be made in a mechanized factory and produced at really large scales. And these industrial weapons often are, they're ending up overpowering some militaries. The British were defeated in Southern Africa by the Zulu during some pretty spectacular battles in 1789, but the British still end up conquering the Zulu nation, because their overall military success, despite fighting some of the fiercest, most well-trained warriors literally in the world at the time, they simply had more bullets and they could fire them faster and shoot more people. And that gave them a military advantage over peoples that they were conquering. I saw the question asking about raw materials coming out of Africa, and people have already answered it for me, which is fantastic. Ivory, salt, and gold are traditional. Gold continues to be important in the 19th century. Diamonds continue to be or become super important with the discovery of huge diamond nodes in Southern Africa. Palm oil, which was used as an industrial lubricant in West Africa. And then in East Africa, we start to see cotton production increase, and coffee production in Kenya actually increases. Rubber production as well coming out of Central Africa. So when we're talking raw materials, in general, we're talking about things that literally come from the ground or from plants that grow from the ground. That's what we mean by raw materials. And then manufactured goods are things that take those raw materials and transform them into another product. Oh, I'm flying, but I really want to give you as much of this content as I possibly can. So how did states expand? In the 19th century, one of the things that we see that I'm going to have to cover really fast, but this idea of shifting from non-state control to state control. So you might remember folks like the Dutch East India Companies, or the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company, so our two East India companies from the earlier time period. Those private companies lose their control of territories, and the governments themselves of the Netherlands and of Britain take over the territories that those companies had controlled. Another example that's really a shocking one that your textbook probably talks about is the shift from private ownership of the Congo by King Leopold II actually to the Belgian government. Leopold owned the Congo individually, and he allowed private rubber companies to run the country for him and to extract both rubber resources, but also extract labor from the population at a massive human cost. It was some of the most brutal and oppressive examples we see of European imperialism in Africa. The conditions actually got to be so bad in the Congo Free State that human rights concerns in the 19th century, when we still believed in scientific racism, prompted the Belgian government to seize control of the colony away from King Leopold and take control of it themselves. The Belgian government wasn't a whole lot kinder, but they did have some regulations in place that Leopold had not upheld within the Congo. And so we're seeing that shift away from corporate or individual control of colonies to government control of colonies. Practically speaking, we see European states using both welfare and diplomacy to expand their empires. So in some cases, Europeans conquer territories. In other places, they negotiated agreements with indigenous leaders to form, I would say, unequal partnerships, but to form agreements that allowed for protections of the indigenous populations and the preservation, in many cases, of indigenous rulers. And so the elites preserve their positions, but the Europeans gain formal control over the territory. The Berlin Conference that establishes the Scramble for Africa in 1884 is another vocab term you should be familiar with. The Berlin Conference was when the European representatives from European governments sat down at a table in Berlin and divided Africa up amongst themselves. The idea being that they didn't want to cause a major war between European powers over Africa. So if they could negotiate with each other about dividing it, that would be better. No African representatives were invited to the conference or allowed to speak at the conference. And so the actual practical conquest of Africa had to happen separately from the initial imperial expansion. But what we see, though, as the Europeans go out into Africa to claim the territories that they divided up on the map, that they use both diplomacy. We see British negotiations in West Africa and Southern Africa, making agreements, as well as regions taken by force. The French in Northern Africa conquer territory by force. In some cases, when negotiations failed in West Africa, both the British and the French took territory that way. Okay, I am flying, and I know it's really fast, and I appreciate you all sticking with me. We need to talk briefly about settler colonies. This is another vocab word that you should write down and either look up or ask your teachers about. So the difference between a settler colony and other types of colonies is how many Europeans wind up going there. So in what I would call a resource colony, we might see a small delegation of Europeans in terms of administration and governance there, but we don't see widespread movement of Europeans to settle and live in that place. But some of the colonies were settler colonies, and they managed the land and the resources by not just directly ruling, but by replacing the effort was made to replace the indigenous populations, either through violence and destruction of indigenous peoples or by forced assimilation, by forcing indigenous peoples to become like the Europeans. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are all examples of British settler colonies. Australia, we know, was a penal colony. British initially sent prisoners to Australia to work in labor camps, but it did gradually become a settler colony. New Zealand is a really good example of a settler colony where British citizens moved to New Zealand to establish settlements there and to attempt to push out the indigenous Maori people. So 3 types of expansion on the part of Europeans. I know this is really fast, and I am sorry that it is going so quickly for you. This was just a lot of content to cover in one night. So we're going to keep pressing forward briefly because I think this is going to answer some of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat, although you guys are doing awesome answering questions for each other. So keep up that great work there as I continue to talk through stuff. I want to talk about economic imperialism. Because it's weird and confuses people. And so I want to give you a brief definition. Economic imperialism is control of a country or territory through economic influence rather than direct political or military takeover. Sometimes we see, right, just conquest of a place. Bam, it's taken over. That's imperialism. But we also see this more subtle economic imperialism. And economic imperialism can be done both by governments and by private businesses. So let's look at a couple of examples. We see like government-based economic imperialism with the spheres of influence in China after the Opium Wars. So the initial opium trade, right, the British are smuggling opium from India into China. It was designed to break open Chinese trade with Europe because the Chinese had been very resistant to trading with the Europeans for a variety of reasons. And when Chinese resistance to the opium trade got to be too extreme, the British actually declare war on China, and they fight a series of wars in the 1830s. And the British win the Opium Wars. And that victory gives them a favorable set of conditions in the treaties. So we had a question in the question box about unequal treaties. Unequal treaties simply mean that the conditions agreed to by both parties favor one party considerably above another party. And so the treaties at the end of the Opium Wars are an example of an unequal treaty because the British in particular gain all of these advantages. They gain the right to trade wherever they want to in China. They gain informal zones of control economically, even outside of territories that they were granted by the treaties. For example, China gave up Hong Kong to the British until the 21st century. But even besides that, right, we see that there's this economic imperialism. These British and French and even some German businesses are able to like really have a heavy influence on the governance and trade practice of certain regions of China because of this trade agreement. My favorite example of economic imperialism, the easier one for me to see, though, is the corporate economic imperialism in Latin America. The like literal actual Dole fruit company that you buy pineapples and bananas from today had huge control over governments in newly independent Latin American countries. And this is the origin of the phrase banana republic. And these corporations would buy politicians in order to get favorable corporate treatment. And the result of this is beneficial in terms of profits for these fruit companies, but it also leads to political instability because elections are being rigged and manipulated to favor these companies and creating political unrest among people whose voices aren't being heard, even after, right, these series of revolutions to have their voices heard, inspired by Enlightenment ideas. We see long-term poverty because the policies are designed to favor the companies instead of the workers. We see long-term economic weakness because the whole economy of some of these countries, like Nicaragua, for example, becomes based around fruit production. And as fruit prices vary over time, Nicaragua doesn't have a diverse enough economy to build itself up in times when fruit prices are typically low. So if that phrase banana republic is helpful to you because you're like, oh, it's like that store, but it actually means this horrible historical thing, that's a good phrase to keep in mind. You want to be a little bit careful about using it in common speech because it is a helpful phrase for us to remember economic imperialism, but it is also often used by people to perpetuate really negative stereotypes about Latin America that are super offensive, really unhelpful. They don't acknowledge the complexities of life and culture and community in Latin America. So, right, economically speaking, helpful. Talking about people in this way, not helpful. So just a little note on that. Okay, I'm flying. It's super fast. I'm not even going to apologize for it. I had a whole question I was going to ask you about, so I'm just going to throw it up on the screen, ask you to think about it as I talk. How would you respond if someone came into your community and told you that everything you know about government, culture, language, the way you dress, the food you eat is completely barbaric, uncivilized, and needed to change? And the reason I ask this question, and the reason I want to encourage you to think about it, is that often my students struggle with the idea that peoples whose lands are conquered, who are these people? What were their decision-making processes? I think too often our history books either tell us directly or allow us to fall into lazy thinking that indigenous peoples are passive and that they are unable to succeed against powerful industrial states. This isn't true. Imperialism isn't inevitable. It happened, but it wasn't this like inexorable, inevitable process that people just had to like, oh, there's nothing I can do about it. Indigenous peoples were active throughout the whole process of imperialism. In some cases, we see indigenous peoples participate in diplomacy with imperialists, sometimes giving up land in exchange for power or wealth, sometimes giving up land to preserve their people or to prevent war. That they saw the strength of this outside power and saw the benefit of negotiations. But other indigenous peoples resisted, often aggressively, both before and after becoming part of these massive empires. These are people who are inspired by nationalist ideas just the same as anybody else. You probably learned about nationalism, that identifying with and that pride in one's country. And it's usually introduced in the Age of Revolutions with North America and Haiti and Latin America and the Central European revolutions of 1848. But nationalism wasn't reserved for Europeans. We actually see the beginnings of nationalist movements and groups in the 19th and 20th centuries throughout Asia and Africa, long before the famous nationalist leaders of the 20th century were ever involved in the movements in these countries. For example, the Indian National Congress, formed in 1885. Gandhi was 16 years old when the Indian National Congress was formed, and he had nothing to do with it. He became a big part of the Indian National Congress, but it was originally formed to expand Indian participation in government and actually to facilitate political dialogue between Indian elites and the British government in India. This was a nationalist movement in the 1880s. Nationalist movements existed throughout Africa. Nationalist movements existed in the Middle East and in Asia. And many of these nationalist groups raised questions about the legitimacy of colonial leaders. And they were leaders in some of the anti-colonial movements that developed. So let's talk about some of these indigenous responses, these ways of resistance. The first is direct resistance. We see indigenous peoples fighting back against imperialism. We see it in 1857 in India. Sometimes it's called the 1857 Rebellion. Sometimes it's called the Sepoy Mutiny. Sometimes, if you're in India, it's called the First War of Independence. British rule in India generally did not respect Indian traditions, either Muslim or Hindu, and they were gradually stripping away the customs and practices that were important to the general population. So a rumor starts in India that that the cartridges used by British forces, including the Indian militias, the sepoys, were greased in pork and beef fat, which would have offended both Muslim and Hindu soldiers. It's not entirely clear historically whether that was actually true, but the rumor was so strong that these Indian militias actually rose up in rebellion against the East India Company. They're fighting in direct resistance to the British authorities. The part of the reason I think we don't think enough about direct resistance is that most often it was unsuccessful for indigenous peoples. And that was the case in India. The British forces quashed the various rebellions that arose throughout northern India. Control of India actually passes from the British East India Company to the British Crown directly, and the British solidify their control after 1857 of India as a colony. But the point is that the resistance comes from, right, this desire to hold on to previous traditions. If you want an example of successful resistance, we should think about Ethiopia in East Africa. When the Italians attempted to use language in a treaty with the Ethiopians to sneakily claim rule over Ethiopia, the Ethiopians gathered a massive army with sophisticated weapons that they had bought from other Europeans and pushed the Italians not just out of Ethiopia, but out of East Africa entirely. And the success of the Ethiopian resistance, and in particular the Battle of Adwa, allowed Ethiopia to remain independent even as the scramble for Africa occurred around it. So this direct resistance is occurring throughout the conquered territories. We also see resistance that we don't always think about as resistance, but in the creation of new states, that nationalism and resistance to empire means that in some cases, new countries got created. And if we think about the Balkans, so the Balkans are that territory in the Eastern Mediterranean near Turkey. So kind of east of Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Albania, the Balkans. As Ottoman power declined in the Eastern Mediterranean, nationalist movements actually led to independence movements and the creation of new countries on the edges of the empire, including Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Albania. These movements were similar to other European nationalist movements. They were founded on a shared identity based on language, culture, history, and religion. So many of the places that formed new nations could not and did not identify with an Ottoman identity. They were also helped and supported by foreign military intervention from allies in Russia, Britain, or France, who saw the creation of new countries in Eastern Europe as an opportunity to weaken the Ottomans and to gain allies in that region. But we can think of it as another indigenous response. These are indigenous groups under Ottoman control who are pushing for their independence. And then the last kind of category of indigenous resistance is the one that somebody has already brought up in the chat, but it's cultural and religious-based rebellions. So the Xhosa cattle killing movement in the 1850s was a movement in response to a disease that was killing Xhosa cattle, but also the oppression of the Xhosa people in southern Africa living under Dutch and British colonial rule. And so we see a spiritual movement sweeping through the Xhosa people, a series of visions that lead them to slaughter hundreds of thousands of cattle. Because the prophecy said that the cattle would be returned to the people by their ancestors if they killed them. So they're sacrificing the cattle to their ancestors, and that the ancestors then would support the people, sweep the white men into the sea, and the spirits would be appeased. the prophecies failed to come true, and tens of thousands of Xhosa starved in the resulting famine. The British governor actually refused to help the Xhosa unless they gave up their claims to their land and went to work in British labor camps. And so the result is this devastating loss of people, territory, and power for the Xhosa. A second and similar example is one that textbooks don't often include, which I find shocking because it was one that my African history professor talked a lot about in college. And so I thought everybody knew about it until I learned that it was actually there's a government cover up in Tanzania to cover up this rebellion. But the Maji Maji rebellion in the early 20th century is a rebellion against the Germans in modern day Tanzania. And it involves animist and spiritual beliefs, including a war medicine, that there were these spiritual leaders who had this medicine that was made from corn and millet and water that was supposed to make the people invulnerable to bullets so the men could fight courageously. It was supposed to make women and children strong and fast so that they could escape if they had to from these battles. And it inspired a military rebellion against the Germans, who then initiated a scorched earth campaign that not only killed people in punishment for the rebellion, but destroyed all of their crops and resulted in famine and death of thousands of people as a punishment for the rebellions. And in this third kind of cultural and religious rebellion, it's really easy for us in 2020 to roll our eyes at spiritual beliefs and practices that are so different from ours. But it's helpful to remember that spirituality, including prophecies or magic medicines, this is ingrained in the cultural identity of many cultures globally for thousands of years. And it's really only in the last 250 years that these ideas are being rejected, especially by Western cultures, more often than they are accepted. So as we think about culture and religious-based rebellions, we want to acknowledge that these beliefs were genuine, they were sincere. I don't have any error messages about my video, so it may be on your end if you are seeing tech problems from me. But I want us, as we're thinking about indigenous resistance and rebellion, just to really give credit to the people who, in their sincere belief that they could defeat European resistance, but also notice the European response in both cases to the Xhosa and to the Maji Maji. Notice that the end result is not just defeat, but that the British and the Germans use the defeat of African peoples as an opportunity to punish them, and that these imperialists are using their racist attitudes, their belief in their own superiority to say to indigenous peoples, your beliefs are inferior and your lives are worth less than ours. And that's a part of imperialism that we can't wash over. We have to acknowledge the harshness and the brutality of what imperialism meant, that resistance may have failed on the part of many indigenous peoples, but it doesn't make it less significant. And in fact, it highlights the harshness of European oppression and brutality as they perpetuated and expanded their empires and their conquest. All right, I've got at least one question in my question box. I want to take a look at it. Okay, this is a question actually going back to talking about economic imperialism and the fruit companies in Latin America. So the companies harmed people because the laws were made to help them instead of support the people. Why were the people trying to support the fruit companies? And the reality of economic imperialism, Daisy and anybody else who was wondering, is that the people weren't supporting the fruit companies. The fruit companies were paying bribes to politicians to get supportive policies. And so the people's voices were being lost. And that's why we call it economic imperialism, that these companies, these outside companies, have control over a territory, even without military conquest or replacing the government with a foreign power. And that's what we mean by economic imperialism, is they're using money to gain benefit for a foreign country rather than for the people of that land itself. So hopefully that was an answer that helps you out, Daisy. I hope you're still here. Okay, I had some practice questions. Looking at time and wanting to really respect your time and your need to study or get some sleep, possibly. AP students who don't sleep enough. I just want to open it up to your questions. We'll skip over my practice questions. I'll probably link the slides as a resource for those of you with Plus memberships, and you can see my questions if you want them. But I want to, that'll come in a little bit. I'll see if I can drop the link in for people right now in a little bit. But if you've got questions for me, can you drop them either in the question box or in the chat? I'm going to take a drink of water because I've been talking a lot. And then I will do that. I actually cannot share my screen and drop you a link. So I'm just going to stop screen sharing and you can look at my lovely face. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so seriously, what questions do you have? There's a link to slides from tonight, and you can see them. It'll also come with all of my presenter notes. Please excuse any spelling in the presenter notes. They're just notes. It is not a be-all, end-all. This is not everything you could possibly know about imperialism. So if there is something you are wondering about, I could probably stay for about 5 more minutes and answer some questions. What you got for me? There's Eric coming to the rescue, telling us that next week is going to be practice questions, which is awesome. Eric writes the best practice questions. I wish I could be in Eric's class, steal all of his practice questions. How is Japan counted as an imperialist? We actually see Japan doing a lot of the same things that the Europeans and the Americans are doing. They're taking the amount of territory claimed by Japan ends up being a little bit smaller in the 19th century. But we see Japanese conquest in Korea. We see Japanese conquest in some of the Pacific Islands. And so it is that gradual expansion. Japan will take any opportunity as we get into the 20th century to expand onto mainland Asia and into northern China, although that happens a little bit later than what we're talking about here. But yeah, many of the same processes happen with Japanese imperialism as with Western imperialism. So they get kind of lumped in together on the list as an industrialized power, expanding their territory. Logan, thank you for the opportunity for me to go back and talk about settler colonies. I've got a question here in the question box. So we've got what I call, I don't know what anybody else calls them. I call them resource colonies, where it's about extraction of resources from a place. So the Congo would be a great example of a resource colony. A settler colony, a better example of that might be Canada or New Zealand, where resources are important coming out of those places. But more important in a settler colony is that it is a place where people from, in the case of Canada and New Zealand, Great Britain, people from that home country are going and settling in and living in that place. And so it kind of becomes an outpost of British culture in the region. And so settler colonies are about bringing in Western or European peoples to push out, sometimes literally pushing out indigenous peoples, or if not actually pushing out the peoples, pushing out indigenous culture and reforming people into a new civilization. That's a settler colony. Seeing a question in the chat about capitulation. I'm going to do a quick Google search and get a good definition for that word, and then I'll give you examples. So to capitulate means to surrender. So capitulations are examples of surrendering. You're probably thinking maybe about the Opium Wars and China's capitulation to the European powers. At the end of the Opium Wars, China had to surrender and had to come to treaty negotiations from a lower status than the British. And so the British get basically all of the good elements of the treaty. We also see capitulations in the Ottoman Empire, where again they are surrendering to and coming in a lower position to negotiations with Russia or with the European powers, giving up land. Okay, so I've got 2 more questions. I think that's all I've got time for. So I'll do Daisy's question about social Darwinism and Hanya's question about reforms. And I'll actually do them in reverse order. So were the reforms a response, like the Tanzimat reforms or the Qing self-strengthening? I wouldn't see those as a response necessarily to imperialism, because both the Qing and the Ottomans were empires. Those reforms are an attempt to maintain imperial control of their empires and not lose to another empire. When I was talking about indigenous responses, I'm thinking about territories that are being conquered by Europeans and are resisting that imperial control, either at the beginning or even during control of Europeans. So that's kind of where I would draw that line. Really, if you are giving a specific historical example to support your reasoning, and you're answering whatever question you're being given, you can choose whatever example sticks with you and makes the most sense. Daisy's question was about social Darwinism versus natural selection. Natural selection is like our scientific model that observes in the natural world a survival of individuals within a species that have certain evolutionary advantages. And so individuals within a species that I'm not a biology teacher, but this is my best understanding. Individuals within a species that have better adaptations to their environment survive and pass on their genetics to their offspring. And so we see the species adapts over time to changes within its environment. Social Darwinism attempts to take that model and apply it to human societies. And it says, okay, our marker for adaptation and for evolution is going to be technological and industrial progress. And so social Darwinism is looking at people who have high technological advancement and saying that those people are more greatly evolved, and that people with lower technological advancement are at a lower state of evolutionary being. It is not a biological thing. There was an attempt to link biology to it. It is not a scientific, rigorously developed thing. It is an attempt to justify racism using science. And it's really uncomfortable, and it's really ugly, and it's not something that's entirely gone from the world today, and that probably makes it even more important to know about. All right, that's all the questions I have time for. That was a lot of content in a little bit of time. So to everybody who stuck it out to the end with me, thank you so much for being here tonight. Thanks for bearing with me. I hope that it gave you at least some vocab terms that you could take back to your teacher and say, hey, I learned about this thing on Fiveable. Can you explain it to me a little bit more? Because that's what I'm hoping my students are going to do. If any of my students are out there tonight, come back to class with questions about specific vocab. And we got 2 weeks on imperialism that we're going to talk about. So best of luck to everybody wherever you are at in terms of your term, finals, not finals, midterms maybe for some of you. Best of luck to you in terms of whenever your next test is coming. Come back to Fiveable. We've got lots of streams happening every Thursday in AP World content, and all of the streamers are here to help you and to make you feel confident in your knowledge. So you guys are awesome, and I hope that we'll see you again on the next stream.